Hello everybody, it's Mr. Colling. I'm pleased to take your assembly this week, and something which I hope will stimulate some thought and give you some ideas for the future. I'm going to talk about two things that you'll hear a lot about if you put the news on in the last few weeks and months: the pandemic and our environmental crisis. Both of them hugely significant events, things that people are thinking about and talking about all the time. I'm going to talk about each of them in turn. First of all, let's think a little bit about the environmental crisis. If you've kept your eyes and ears open, you will know that there are quite a number of different things that are affecting us across the world because of the impact of the human race. Pollution, greenhouse effect, plastic pollution, the cutting down of forests, food waste, loss of various species, all sorts of these things that are always being talked about and have been for many, many years now. If you ask Google for a list of endangered species, you will very quickly get a very long list of different types of animals and plants that are at risk of becoming totally extinct. I've given you a very short list here, and they're some of the things that I'm going to be talking about later in this assembly. What I find very interesting is that the reasons for extinction of these different creatures is very different from their particular circumstances, and why it is that they're actually going to be extinct requires a little bit more thought. So we'll have a look at that later on in the assembly. Before I do that, I want just to think also about the pandemic. It's a global situation that we've been in for the last 18 months. It's the biggest crisis, certainly the biggest health crisis since the flu pandemic in the 1900s. It's a massive death toll across the world. And in some countries, notably at the moment, mostly India, there's a huge impact still being felt, even though in this country things seem to have calmed down quite a lot. It has had a huge impact on the lives of every single person on this earth, not just in our country, but in every single country of the world. And I think that's something which makes it so significant and is worth just stopping and thinking for a few minutes about. I can't think of anything else other than perhaps the environmental crisis that actually has had such a big impact on every single person. You could easily argue that it is a fight for survival. In many cases, sadly, for many individuals who've lost their lives, they lost that fight for survival. But if you look at it in a bigger sense, perhaps a fight for survival of the human race. If we haven't taken action, then we could be looking at extinction ourselves. And I don't say that lightly, but that is really the truth of the situation. What's our response to the pandemic been? Well, in order for us to fight for our survival, we've had to go into lockdown, and that's happened in many, many countries across the world. We've had to close everything down. All of our businesses, even schools, as you'll remember last year, were closed, other than for things that were really essential for life, things that we needed to keep us alive, for example, food shopping and that sort of thing. Suddenly, a lot of the things that we took for granted and things that we felt were essential were questioned. The ability to mix with friends, the ability to move around freely, to go away on holiday to other countries, we might consider to be a normal part of everyday life. But suddenly they've been challenged, and the question has been, do we really need to do these things? And because they would put us at greater risk, actually they've all been stopped. So we've reduced travel, the manufacturing industries have been reduced, we've all had to keep in isolation, we've had to pay huge amounts of attention to improving hygiene. All of those things we felt have been necessary, but things that we've had to do, and we've done relatively easily in a short period of time. In April 2020, because of the lockdown, there were 114 million fewer tourists travelling than there were in the same month of the year before. If you look at the St Mark's Square photographs here, you can see on the left what it normally looks like in a typical year, but on the right, how during the pandemic it was completely deserted. Quite a stark image, I think you'll agree. Normal flight patterns have been suspended, and you can see the photograph on the left shows what that looks like across the globe, and the huge crowds of aeroplanes all lined up on runways at airports and airfields not in use. Cruise ships, normally taking large numbers of people on holidays, have all been taken into their ports and are just sitting there empty, awaiting the go-ahead to be able to travel again. You may have heard some of the stories in the early part of the pandemic when the spread of coronavirus was very, very rapid on a cruise ship because there are a large number of people in a confined space. All of that's come to an end. City centres have been deserted, and you can see here the road networks, in this particular case in China, how totally empty they were at the height of the pandemic at that time last year. Hugely different from what you would normally expect to see, and showing the impact of everybody having to remain at home. Let's go back and look at the environmental crisis for a moment, and in particular at some of those endangered species I mentioned earlier on. Here's a photograph of some loggerhead turtles that live in the sea. Their numbers have been in steep decline, and they're now starting to be repopulating. The reason for that is that during the lockdown, the beaches where these loggerhead turtles breed are normally inhabited by humans during the holiday season. And this means that the movement of the turtles from the sea onto the beach into nests where they would breed is severely restricted. Because there's nobody on the beach during the lockdown period, this has meant that the turtles have been able to move freely again between the sea and the coast, and they've been able to breed much more readily. And the result of that is there's been a huge increase in their population. All of that's happened in a relatively short period of time during the time that restrictions on travel have been in place. It hasn't taken long for that steep decline to be reversed. We often think of pollution as being substances which cause problems in the air or in the sea. Another form of pollution is sound pollution or noise pollution. And one of the things that I didn't realise was that cruise ships actually create a lot of noise at a frequency that is disturbing to sea creatures, in this case looking at humpbacked whales. This disturbs their ability to be able to communicate with one another. One of the results of that is that mothers rarely leave their young because they need to look after them, keep them safe. But since the cruise ships have not been sailing around the sea, that's meant that the mothers have been able to communicate much more easily with their young, and so they've been able to leave them much further away whilst they go in search of food. And they can communicate over a greater distance and know that their young are still safe. One of the effects of this is it has meant that the mothers, the adult humpbacked whales, have been able to collaborate with others in order to feed much more efficiently. And you guessed it, that's improved their breeding rates because they've been able to feed themselves and their young much more easily. So the survival rates of their young has been improved. Another example of the impact of the pandemic having a positive effect on one of those endangered species. Here's a photograph of the Golden Gate Bridge at San Francisco Bay. It's a habitat of white-crowned sparrows. Because of the usual sound pollution from traffic roaring as it goes across this bridge, this has interfered again with the communication of these birds. And it's affected the bird song and caused them to change to communicate with a much higher pitch than they were used to. Since the bridge has been completely empty of traffic, the noise level has been significantly reduced, and that has meant that these birds have been able to change their song back to a much deeper pitch than it did before. And that's enabled them to mate more readily. They've been able to find mates much more easily, and therefore, again, breeding rates have increased. So yet another endangered species that has started to turn a corner and increase in numbers. As humans have taken over more and more land in order to farm their crops, this has actually reduced the natural habitat of these Assam elephants down to 5% of what it used to be. And as you can imagine, that has put these animals at huge risk of survival. Because of the reduction in the natural habitat, one of their behaviours was to raid crops that humans had planted in order that they had enough to eat. And that resulted in humans fighting back, if you like, by lighting fires to scare off these elephants, making the situation worse. And over time, that's caused a great significant reduction in population. During the lockdown, a lot of people in India actually were not working, as was the case in many other countries, and that gave them the time, many city workers, out in the country to come up with different solutions to this problem. One of the things that they did was they actually planted a barrier of foods that were suitable for these elephants to eat between their natural habitat and where the farmland was. The effect of that was that it enabled the elephants to leave their crops alone. And again, breeding rates increased, partly also because they were given a much greater food supply. I mentioned earlier on that there was a significant reduction in travel during the lockdown periods, particularly air travel, but also cars and sea travel, and also a reduction in industrial activity. That has had a very immediate and visible effect on the amount of pollution in many parts of the world. In the Himalaya area of India, you can see photographs here where the mountains can be seen clearly for the first time because they're not shrouded in pollution. And many people living in towns and villages in that region have been able to see the Himalaya mountain range 200 miles away for the first time in 30 years. They might never have travelled to see the Himalayas, but actually never seen them because the pollution was blocking their view. That's only taken a matter of 2 or 3 months of the lockdown for that change to take place. We started off at the beginning of these slides talking about the pandemic as being a disaster, a natural disaster. And I would proffer the view that we need perhaps to stop and think whether or not it depends on your viewpoint. If you're human, then clearly it's put us all at risk, and therefore it's very easy to label it as a disaster. If you're looking at it from the point of view of one of these endangered species, you might actually consider it to be a positive thing because you've been able to thrive. You might also look at it from the viewpoint of the Earth as a whole and consider whether or not this is a way of the Earth surviving. Humans present a huge threat to the Earth in all sorts of different ways, some of which I've mentioned here. And this pandemic has put a limit on some of our activities and caused us to restrict what we do so that we're in a situation of enabling other species to thrive. That might seem like a challenging view, but what I think it tells us is that it's even more important that we take action to protect the Earth. It shows that we can have a huge impact in a positive way in a fairly short space of time. I'm not suggesting for a minute that we want there to be another pandemic. That would be an awful thing for so many people. But what it does do is to say that there are things that we can do in the way that we lead our lives that can have a very positive and significant impact on the other species that we share the Earth with. I think that it's very easy for us to shrug our shoulders and say, well, it's not my problem, or there's not much I can do. But actually, we've all been in a position where we've had to work together across the world to a common aim. We've had no choice because of the pandemic. It's been presented to us with no choice because of the fight for survival. But I think one of the things that comes out of that situation, from my point of view, is to say perhaps it does bring a sense of hope for the future. It shows that we can make a difference. And maybe some of the things that we did during the lockdown, we can do at least in part and reach some forms of compromise so that we're not having the negative impact on the Earth that we've seen over recent years and decades. I'd like you to have a think about that, and I hope this gives you a little bit of incentive to want to do something different with the way that we collectively lead our lives so that we can make a big difference on the earth for future generations.